I made this little diagram here to kind of give you a sense of what you might be doing when you're abstracting perceptually. And so you could say, think about something that's that complicated. It's sort of my model of how complex the world is, but the world is a lot more complex than that. But the world is made out of, everything is made out of littler things, and those littler things are made out of littler things, and so forth. And those things are nested inside bigger things, and so forth. And where you perceive on that level of abstraction is somewhat arbitrary. It has to be bounded by your goals. That's the other thing, is that your perceptual structures are determined by the goals that you have at hand. I mean, some of that's not completely true, because your perceptual systems also have limitations, right? There's things you can't see or hear even if you need to. So there are limitations built in, but within that set of limitations, you're still trying to tune your perceptions to your motivated goals. And that's also very useful to think about when you're trying to understand artificial intelligence, because for human beings, without goals, there's no perception. Because there's no filtering mechanism that you can use to determine the level of resolution at which you perceive. Anyway, so there's a thing made of smaller things which are made out of smaller things, and it's kind of my iconic representation of the complexity of the world. And then you could think, well, what is this? How can you see this object? And I think if you just look at it, you can detect, it's like a Necker cube, you know, those cubes that are line drawings that you can see the front of, and then it'll flip to the back. Have you seen those? So this is kind of Necker cube like, or at least it is for me, in that when I look at it, my perceptions play around with it. Sometimes I focus on the kind of cross-like shape in the middle, and sometimes I can see these other lines, and then sometimes I'll focus on that square, and sometimes I can see the little dots there, or maybe one dot, and my perceptions are going like this, trying to fit a pattern to it. And you can kind of detect that when you're watching it. And so I would say, well, you have the options of perceiving this in its full complexity, or you can simplify it. Essentially, there's lots of ways you can simplify it, but some of them are laid out there. So you take the complex thing, you make a low resolution representation of it. So that's the rough area that all those dots occupy. That's the rough area broken down to its 4 most fundamental quadrants. That might be how you would look at it if this was a map of an orchard and you were trying to walk from south to north. That would be a useful representation. This combines this and this. That's that's the highest level of resolution that you can perceive this object at. That's lower resolution than the object itself. So the first issue is, how should you look at things? Well, that's a problem that intelligence has to solve. So that's one of the problems that intelligence goes after. And then I think what happens is we have the thing in itself, and then we simplify it with a perception, and that's like an iconic representation, and then we nail the iconic representation with a word. And that's how we compress the world's complexity into something that we can manage. We take the complex thing, make it into an icon, and represent the icon with a word. And then when I throw you the word, so to speak, you decompose it into the icon, and then decompose it even further into the thing, if you know the icon and you know the thing. And so then we can use shorthand, right? Because you have representational structures and so do I, and I'm just tossing you markers about your representational structures, and you can unfold them. That's what you do when you're reading a novel, because the novel comes alive in your imagination in your own idiosyncratic way. And it wouldn't if you didn't understand the references of the novel, right? The novelist has to assume that your basic perceptual structures and your intuitions and your instincts are basically the same as his or hers, because otherwise they have to assume that, because otherwise they would be lost in an infinite regressive explanation. So, and it's problematic often. For example, if you start reading Victorian novels, you may find that it takes a while to get into them, because the presuppositions, the expectations are slightly different, and so is the language. You have to update the representations. But anyway, so that's roughly, as far as I'm concerned, that's roughly a representation of what intelligence is doing in the world. Or a big part of it. It's how in the world do you look at things so that you can use them for the purposes that you need to use them for. And then the next problem that intelligence has to solve, which is related, is once you've got the perceptual landscape sorted out, how do you abstractly represent the action patterns that you're going to implement in the world? So it's, how do you perceive where you are now? How do you perceive where you're going? and how do you construct up and then implement strategies that enable you to move from where you are to where you're going. So it's a continual process of mapping and movement. And so it's navigation. That's what we're doing in the world all the time, is navigating through it, because we're mobile creatures. We're navigating through it, attempting to make the world manifest itself in accordance with our wishes. And that's the fundamental problem that intelligence has to solve. And animals have their perceptions to rely on, but we have our perceptions and our ability to abstract from those perceptions multiple times, and then to abstract finally into language. So we live in a very abstracted world. And it also means that we can learn a lesson in one place and generalize it across many other places, which is also something that animals have a hard time doing, because they don't know how to do that initial perceptual generalization. So okay, so then the question might be, well, if intelligence has to solve the problem of how to perceive and navigate within the world towards ends, in order to fulfill, in order to make the world manifest what it needs to manifest so that you can maintain yourself and stay alive, what ends is it orienting itself towards? And I think that's a good way of thinking about the traits. The traits motivate the perceptual frame. And so you might think that, well, extroverted people are after social success. And you can understand why that would be, because social success brings with it all sorts of rewards. Social failure brings costs, and you could also understand why that would frighten you away from it. And social success also requires the expenditure of effort, and introverted people seem to be much more conservative in a sense in terms of expending energy socially, and I suppose they're protecting themselves to some degree against the possibility of social failure. We don't really know. We know more about how extroverts, in some sense, how and why extroverts orient themselves the way they do in the world. We're not so sure about introverts. What it is that, what the proper landscape is for introverts. I can show you a word cloud. I'll do that at some point, that were generated from introverts on Facebook, and they seem to be into fantasy and gaming a lot, and I don't know why that is exactly, because the fantasy element should be more localized in openness, but the introverted types, I mean, I suppose they're the people that are on the Big Bang Theory, roughly speaking. You know, they seem to be the introverted types, and but we don't understand that much about them, exactly how it is that they're orienting themselves in the world. People who are high in neuroticism are oriented towards security and safety. Agreeable people versus disagreeable people are oriented, say, towards cooperation versus competition. Conscientious people are oriented towards order, duty, obligation, and implementation. And open people are oriented towards abstraction, in both ideational and in representation. And so those are also, to some degree, you might also think about those as value systems, right? Because what you value is definitely not only what you pursue. That's too narrow a view. Value is also what you perceive and pursue. And so thinking about these things as this entire frame of reference, I think, is a much better way of doing it. We talked about this earlier, this sort of structure earlier, as a micro-personality. And I mentioned the determination of micro-personalities by fundamental underlying biological systems like defensive aggression and sexual desire and hunger and thirst and so forth. Those are all systems that can grab your perceptions, make you look at the world in a certain way, make you pursue something else in a certain way, and prime action responses that are in keeping with all of that. The traits seem to be something like higher order agglomerations of those more fundamental biological motivations. Although we don't quite understand the relationship between the underlying biology and the traits, we're starting to sort it out. So we know, for example, if you look at the function of the hypothalamus regulates the basic biological motivations that I just outlined, but it's also the place where the exploratory systems find their ultimate physiological grounding, and openness and extroversion seem to be variant manifestations of the exploratory impulse, and that's grounded in the hypothalamus. So we're starting to be able to put the traits, to sort of nail the traits down to their underlying biology. And with regards to neuroticism, well, if you're high in neuroticism, you're more sensitive to anxiety, and that's regulated at least in part by the hippocampus and generated in part by the amygdala. There's another part of the brain called the periaqueductal gray that seems to be associated with the experience of pain, and pain is quite a complex phenomena. Depression is pain-like, grief is pain-like, social isolation is pain-like, disappointment is pain-like. There's anxiety components to that too. And so neuroticism seems to be something like threshold for activation in those negative emotion systems. So if you're higher in neuroticism, 1 unit of uncertainty might produce, let's say, 3 units of psychophysiological response, whereas if you're lower in neuroticism, 1 unit of uncertainty might produce 1 unit of psychophysiological response. It's hard, you know, obviously that's a simplified schemata, but there's variability because if something unexpected or threatening happens to you, it isn't obvious how upset you should get. One answer might be, brush it off, it's nothing. Another answer might be, it's a bloody catastrophe. And often when something uncertain or threatening occurs, you don't have enough information at your disposal to make a full determination of the potential import of the circumstance, especially if it's uncertain. And so then you have to guess at how upset you should be. And where you are on the normal distribution with regards to trait neuroticism, say, that sort of determines what your guess on average is going to be. So, you know, the other, with conscientiousness, say, you might say, well, how hard should you work? Well, that's a really difficult question. If you're going to die tomorrow, and then you probably shouldn't work very hard today at all. So one thing you might say is that the degree to which you should work hard is dependent on your assumptions about the stability of the future. We actually know this to be true because if you put people in wildly uncertain circumstances, they discount the future, which is exactly what you should do, right? It only makes sense to store up goods for future consumption if the future is likely to be very similar to the past and the present. You need a stable society for that. And conscientiousness only works in a stable society, because all you do otherwise, if you're piling up goods, which is kind of what conscientious people do, is leaving them there for the criminals to take, or waiting for the next chaotic upheaval to wipe out everything that you've stored. And so even conscientiousness is a kind of guess. Hardworking people say, well, you know, sacrifice the present for the future. That's great, as long as the future is going to be there and you can predict it. But if it's not going to be there and it's unpredictable, then the right response is take what you can take right now while the getting's good. Now, you know, obviously there are troubles with that too, and I'm speaking, you know, I'm offering rough rules of thumb, but I'm trying to provide you with some indication of how and why these difference in value structures exist, because they're applicable in different environments. You know, sometimes in a dangerous social environment, it's not obvious that being an extroverted person is a good idea, because extroverted people, they stand out, especially if they're extroverted and creative, right? Because not only are they noisy and dominant and assertive, they're also colorful and flamboyant and provocative. Well, that's great if you're in a society that rewards that sort of thing, but you know, if you're ruled by an authoritarian king who wants absolutely no threat whatsoever to his stability ever, then dressing in gray and shutting the hell up is a really good survival tactic. So the utility of the trait depends on the structure of the environment that surrounds it. And that's why there's variability in traits. And so you have to be careful when you're thinking about it from a strict scientific perspective to make the assumption that positioning at any place on the normal distribution is preferable to positioning anywhere else. Now, one exception to that might be IQ. Because one of the things that you can see in with IQ is that people with higher IQs seem to do better, but that's also only true in complex societies. And then there's another problem that seems to emerge with IQ, and I don't know exactly what to make of this, but we know that as women's IQ increases, the probability that they're going to remain without a mate also increases, because women tend to mate across or up dominance hierarchies. And so if you're a woman with an IQ of 130, then you've already eliminated about 95% of the men. And that's only using one criteria. That's just straight intelligence. And so there also might be limitations to the utility of intelligence with regards to reproduction that we don't really understand very well yet. So anyway, so you get the point. So there's these underlying, I kind of put down two value structures there, capitalize on social groups, that would be an extroverted value structure, say, and maintain order, that would be a conscientious strategy. And conscientious people are going to want to maintain order because they don't want things to shift across time, because if they shift too much across time, then the things that have been stored up for the future start to become increasingly irrelevant. There's lots of other reasons to maintain order as well, but that's one of them. So, all right, so that your cognitive ability allows you to do modeling. Now, this is where human beings have leaped ahead of their competition. So, animals can think, but it isn't exactly obvious how they think. They think strategically. I think they think the same way that children think, in some sense, when they're playing with Legos, when they're not thinking about the Legos, you know, when they're just moving them around. We know, like, if you watch a smart predator group like lions go after their target, or watch chimpanzees hunt down a monkey, you can see intelligence at work, because hunting behavior is very, very complicated, obviously, you know, especially if you're chasing something intelligent. But there isn't that level of abstract representation. So let's look at this. So here's a picture of the human brain with someone facing this way, right? So here's the primary motor cortex. Okay, so you're using that to voluntarily move your body. Okay, now then I might say to you, close your eyes and imagine doing something. So just close your eyes and imagine picking up the cup that's in front of you and just visualize it. Okay, so then you might say, well, what part of your brain are you using then? And the answer is, use part of this part, because that's where you have your body represented. But use this part here, the premotor cortex, to envision potential actions. Now, what's happened is that this part of the brain evolved out of this part. And that makes sense, because the first part is just how you would move, but the second part is how you would think about how you would move. And then the next part, which is this part, huge in human beings, is how you would think about how you would think about how you would move. So, because that enables you to start to do extraordinarily abstract planning. So I could say, well, envision how you would pick up the cup. And obviously that's something that you've separated out as a potential simulation from the actual action. But we can talk about extraordinarily high-level abstractions that have effects across multiple specific domains way into the future. And the more abstract that your manipulations become, the more they seem to be moved away, say, from the primary motor cortex out into the prefrontal cortex. Hierarchies of abstraction. And the reason for that, as this was Karl Popper, this is really, really worth thinking about. Why think? Let's say you're an animal and you act and it doesn't go very well, and then you die. Well, you've learned that acting that way didn't work, but now you're dead. So that's not that helpful. And then you might think, well, maybe you should represent how you're going to act. So, you know, here's a box with a snake in it, and your coffee cup is inside the box with the snake in it. And I say to you, imagine picking up the coffee cup, and you imagine it and you think, oh, I'll pick up that coffee cup and then the snake will bite me and I'll die. And so then you decide that implementing the strategy of picking up the coffee cup is probably not a very good idea, and so that stupid idea has to die and not you. And so Popper's idea was that the reason that we developed the capacity to abstract was so that our stupid ideas could die instead of us. And that's really, it's almost impossible to overstate how brilliant an observation that is. Because what it means is that, like, as a standard animal, you would have to produce variants of yourself reproductively to go out into the world and try their hand at survival. And that's pretty costly, because you have to produce all the biological replications of you, so you could only probably manage that maybe 13 times if you really, really worked at it. And then the cost of their failure is extraordinarily high, because they die. Well, you can just sit there and produce like 20 different versions of you extending out over the next week or the next month, and you can run them through a simulation and kill off all the ones that you don't regard as suitable, and then only implement the successful ones. Now, you know, you could debate about how accurate you might be at doing that, because it would depend on your knowledge, but we do know that intelligent people tend to do better across the course of their life. And so it does seem that there is some utility with regards to survival, or at least with regards to positioning in the dominance hierarchy, which is somewhat of a proxy for survival and for reproductive success, there's some association between that and the ability to abstract. So we could say that part of the reason that people got smarter was because smarter people were more likely to stay alive. Now I think it's more complicated than that too, because I believe that human males and females are in an evolutionary cognitive arms race, roughly speaking. And so as men get trickier, women get trickier to understand them, and then as women get trickier to understand, men get trickier to understand them. And so we've been chasing each other around this cortical expansion loop pretty much since we parted ways with the ancestor that we had in common with chimpanzees. And so that's roughly about 7 million years ago. We've undergone a tremendous cortical expansion since then, and there's lots of reasons that have been propelling that. So what do you have to do when you're thinking? Well, you have to figure out where you are and how to see that. You have to figure out where you're going and what that should be, and then you have to generate and represent appropriate action strategies and simulate those in time and space. And then one of the things that's worth noting is that's what you do when you read a story or when you tell a story. And so part of the reason that you like to read stories is because that's exactly what stories are telling you, how someone is going about doing that. And so then you can see how, if you think about preference for fiction, which is actually part of openness, preference for fiction, the utility in fiction is that it allows you to experience a plethora of simulated worlds and to embody the consequences in abstraction without having to go through the trouble of doing that for yourself. And we do know there's good empirical literature now showing, some of it done by ex-students from my lab, showing that reading fiction does improve your interpersonal intelligence, for example, your ability to understand the position of other people, logically enough, because that's what you're doing when you're reading. So, okay, so I'm trying to give you some background so that you can understand what it means to abstract, and also why it's useful, because we need that in order to move forward with the idea of intelligence. So here we go. Okay, so that's how you act voluntarily, and then that's how you represent how you act voluntarily, and then that's how you think about how you represent acting voluntarily. And the reason I'm telling you this is because it's useful to think about intelligence as abstract action, because we tend to think about intelligence as abstract representation, right? Intelligence is the manipulation of facts or the understanding of facts. But if you look at it neurologically, I would say that's a misapprehension, because the part of the brain that does the highest level of abstract thinking is actually something that's emerged from the motor cortex. Now, that doesn't mean you don't use your intelligence to represent. You do. But the purpose of intelligence is to represent potential action patterns, and we're embodied creatures and we need to move in the world. And so that's the proper, as far as I'm concerned, that's the proper way to conceptualize intelligence.